Hi, welcome to the fifth session of World Revolutions. Today marks a transition point in the course. We've been looking at the early modern revolutions, the revolutions in England and the United States and France, and now we're going to be moving towards modern revolutions, revolutions that have occurred specifically in the 20th century. In doing that, today I'm going to devote this time to talking about background, talking about what forces were influencing change in the world prior to and during the 20th century that helped bring about these revolutions. Just as before we talked about the early modern revolutions, we talked about some of the factors that influenced change in an earlier epoch. It was Enlightenment ideas, the commercialization of agriculture. Today we're going to do something similar throughout most of this session. But before we get into that, we are getting close to midterm exam time. And I want to spend a few minutes at the beginning doing a very brief review both on how I grade and also on what kinds of questions to expect. First of all, as you've been told in orientation, these are essay-type exams. So you're answering essay questions. The way I grade, the 3 points that I base grading on are 1, analysis, and here you see, we've got it written out here. That's about 40% of the grading of the exam, meaning this: if the question asks you to be comparative, are you comparative? Do you compare two revolutions and how they took place, why they took place? If we ask, well, tell me about the causes of 3 of these revolutions, do you actually get into why the revolutions occurred, what forces influenced them? If we ask you about the outcomes, again, are you explaining, addressing this question in a comparative, analytical fashion? Do you answer why things happened, how they happened? Do you compare the different revolutions if you're asked to do that? So that's about 40% of your grade. Factual evidence is another 40%. Here, the critical factor is, do you provide some facts to back up whatever type of analysis you're doing? If you're saying, well, the key problem here was the issue of human rights, or rights of the citizen, when we talk about the French Revolution. That was the critical issue. Well, how can we possibly document that? Well, for example, the Declaration of the Rights of Man spells out rights that human beings should have as citizens of a nation. So that's a piece of factual information that you can include to substantiate what you're talking about. These are the kinds of facts, the critical major facts that you want to include to substantiate your analysis. That's the next 40%. And finally, 20% is based on structure, which simply means, is the essay coherently organized? When the graders look at this, they want to look at, do you have a basic introduction? Do you cover a series of key points? And do you write a conclusion? I emphasize over and over again the importance of, when you sit down with the exam, the first thing you should do is write yourself a brief outline, outlining the key points that you're going to cover. Here are 5 or 6 critical points that I need to talk about in answering this question. That way, you'll be sure that the essay is logically structured and that you don't get stuck writing on 1 or 2 items and forget to cover the other 4 or 5 that you meant to cover. If you have an outline and you write to the outline, and again, it can be a series of just one-word topics that you're going to address in the essay. I'm not looking for that. The grader won't be looking to see that when they read the exam, but if you do it for yourself, it'll be very beneficial in terms of how effectively you can answer the questions. Now, I've mentioned these issues before and how we tend to grade and what your grade is based on in terms of the actual exam, but what are the questions likely to be like? We talked a little bit about that at the beginning of the course, but you need a little more substance, and we've got it now that we've covered some of these cases. We've already done 3 of the revolutions: England, the United States, France. Next week we'll do Mexico. I'm just going to concentrate on these 3 right now because these are the 3 that you have material on. And I'm not going to give you the exact questions, obviously, but I'm going to talk about what kinds of questions do I tend to ask. How would I ask questions about this? How do we structure them? And here it's fairly easy to figure out. There are 4 basic things that we have covered in each revolution. We've covered the history of the country, to the extent that how did the history of this particular country influence the coming of the revolution. We've talked about specific causes of the revolutions. We've talked about the goals of the revolution, what were the different groups, what did they aspire to achieve in the revolution, and finally, effects of the revolution. What, if any, were the long-term changes brought about in these societies as a result of the revolutions? This is a basic outline for questions. For example, I might ask you, tell me about the history, causes, and effects of the French Revolution. That is more than enough for a single question. On the other hand, I might ask you to compare 2 or 3 revolutions, take the English, French, and U.S. Revolution, let's just say the 18th century revolution in the U.S. Take those 3 and compare them in terms of causes, goals, and effects. Comparative question. Or if I've given you a very extensive historical treatment, I might just ask you, tell me about the history of this country and how did it contribute to revolution. But most likely, you're going to see a question that asks you about history and causes and effects of a revolution, or some kind of comparative question that looks at causes, goals, and effects. Have to limit it to some degree because, of course, if I'm asking about 2 or 3 revolutions, you only have so much time. How much can you possibly cover? But if you go back through your notes with these points in mind, say, all right, I'm going to look at the history, causes, goals, and effects, develop brief outlines for yourself in terms of each revolution, and then think about the comparative aspects. Well, for example, to what extent were issues involving peasants important? Peasant land, or peasants seeking freedom from feudalism, or peasants reacting against the incremental rise of capitalism? How important is that in each of these revolutions? Well, in 2 of them, it's very important, in England and France. In the U.S., it's not an issue at all because there's no peasantry. There are small farmers moving towards commercial agriculture, but it's a non-issue. So there is an easy comparative point to make, and that's the kind of thing we're looking for. To what extent do they share common causes, common effects, common goals? To what extent are they different? And in writing comparative questions, it's always a smart thing to say, okay, you asked me about causes, goals, and effects about 3 revolutions. Instead of trying to write a separate 2 paragraphs on here's France, here's England, here's the United States, you're much better off taking goals and saying, okay, here were the goals of the 3 revolutions, how they were similar or different. And I say that because otherwise it tends not to be comparative. If you simply say, all right, I'll write about France and then England and then the United States, 3 separate ones, it'll remain 3 separate statements and it will not be highly comparative. But with these points as outline points, you can go in, study your notes, and figure out how to integrate these key elements. What do you need to know about history? What do you need to know about causes, goals, and effects? It gives you a simple outline, and the questions are based on this outline. That's what I look at. That's what I'll be considering. Now, again, we've got one more revolution to cover before the midterm, but those are the basic points that we'll be considering for all of these revolutions. Now, we did talk about history and theory at the beginning of the course, and we're going to talk about the coming of the modern age, modernity, today. But this material is meant to assist you in understanding the revolutions. I will not ask specific questions on this material, the part about theory and the part about modernity today. However, you will be expected to be able to use some of this if I am asking about, well, what are the causes of the revolutions in France and England? Well, what was I talking about in general in these societies and in Europe at this time in terms of Enlightenment ideas, the early rise of capitalism? How do those types of interpretations affect what you're writing? How well do they fit any of the models that we talked about? You should be able to offer some observations in that regard, but you will not have a specific question on that material. Now, you've also had a book to read as of the midterm. What you should be able to do with that book is talk about what was the author's perspective on the revolution. And again, I'm not getting into detail here because it may change later on when this tape is being replayed. What's the author's perspective on the revolution in terms of causes, goals, and effects? And how does that compare with what we talked about in class? Now, how is this interpretation different, similar? You should be able to do that much. You're not expected to have an encyclopedic knowledge of the book. You should be able to go through and say, well, here are a few key actors, some key events that the book talks about in terms of this revolution. Here is the author's interpretations, and how does that compare with what was said in lectures in the class. That's the extent to which you need a knowledge of the book. You do not need to be memorizing endless names, dates, etc. It's an overall knowledge. You should be able to sit down and, in a couple of pages, write up your summary of the book. Okay? These are the major points in the book. If you have that in your mind, and you do get asked a question about the book, you'll have sufficient information to answer the question effectively. And that's what you should do. You should try to summarize it rather than just reading the book through. That's not going to give you enough of a grasp of the book. You need to think it through, write a brief summary, and think about, well, how does this author's interpretation of this revolution compare with what was said in class? Those are the options, okay? Those are the only possibilities for questions. It's going to be about the one or more of the revolutions. It'll deal with either history, causes, effects, goals. The only other possibility is the book, and that will still be summarizing the book's interpretation of revolution and what was said in class. Those are the maximum number of options. You can literally sit down and figure out, here are all the possible questions. There are a limited number of questions that can be asked here and what you'll be able to answer. And of course, you have an option in terms of the question that you're answering on the exam, so you have some leeway there as well. But those are the key points. That's how I'll structure the exam. Okay, let's talk about modernity. When we were dealing with the early part of the course, we were looking at early modern society, particularly in Europe and in North America in one case. We saw societies that, at least in 2 of the 3 cases, were monarchies, societies in 2 of the 3 cases where feudalism still existed, societies in which there were elites, which if not a pure nobility, as in the case of the United States, then at least, as in the case of the United States, they were nobilities or groups of elites who claimed privilege based on birth. And that is certainly true in France and England, where we have this nobility of birth, people with privilege. We have a series of issues in these societies regarding the early rise of capitalism, the problems with states trying to centralize power and institute reforms, and discontents among lower class people in particular about the intrusion of capitalist practices in the countryside or in urban settings. All of those are critical issues for those early modern revolutions. But as we move on to the 20th century, we find a world radically changed in part because of these revolutions. And we need to look at what forces were shaping societies in the 19th and early 20th century that helped bring on the next set of revolutions that we're going to be looking at. One of the factors that is most significant is clearly the triumph of capitalism. If we go back to 1500, which is roughly where we begin, capitalism was hardly a dot on the map. But by the late 19th century, capitalism has become the dominant mode of production in Europe, the United States, North America in general, and it's rapidly penetrating other parts of the globe. The rise of capitalism plays a critical role in what happens in many of these revolutions in the 20th century. Now, capitalism did not come about in some sort of rapid overnight transformation. We've seen some of the early changes that were taking place in early modern England and in France as agriculture becomes commercialized, the enclosure of landholdings in England. These are gradual steps. Landlords using feudal dues as a means of extracting more profit from their land in France. A gradual transition. But the transition that was occurring was profound. The basic relationships that had existed in the countryside were disintegrating. The relationship between peasants and landlords, this feudal order in which the peasant provided a part of his labor or his produce in return for protection from the lord, those relationships were disappearing and would be replaced by capitalist relationships in which people relate to each other based on the payment of wages. This is not a system where we owe loyalty to an individual, rather we accept a job because of the wage that is paid. The owner of the land or of the factory doesn't accept any particular obligation to workers in return. It is simply they are employed at a certain wage, and when they're no longer needed, they'll be dismissed. These were profound alterations because feudalism, if nothing else, helped maintain stability, helped maintain order. People knew their place in society and knew it was unlikely to change through the generations. This is a radical realtering of that system. It will not only affect people in the sense of changing that basic relationship, it will over time eat away at the basic system of peasant agriculture and peasant villages that existed across the globe as of 1500. Not everyone was willing to accept this change. In many cases, such as in England, the transition to capitalism was assisted by the state. In England, there were things called the Poor Laws, meaning the laws affected you if you were poor. And what the Poor Laws specifically provided for was that people were not allowed to be indigent. You were not allowed to be unemployed. You were not allowed to simply roam the countryside. Under the Poor Laws, you'd be required to go to a workhouse. And you could then be assigned out to a manufacturer or a landowner to work on behalf of that individual. The idea was to force people into a system of wages. If you've read or seen the story of Oliver Twist, Oliver's fate being sent out as an apprentice after being in the workhouse was a common fate for people in 19th and 18th century England, because if you didn't have a means of support for yourself, the state could force you into a system where you would be employed. Many people were avoiding this transition to capitalism, trying to resist it, and the state was acting to try to enforce precisely that kind of system. This transition not only radically changes social relationships, as the old feudal order, the old patrimonial, patriarchal systems where you have someone who allegedly looks over you and takes care of you and where there are certain permanent relationships. In addition to that transition, there is also some basic physical changes that occur in the world. The Industrial Revolution, which is the most written about and most obvious aspect of the rise of capitalism, has an enormous impact on the ability of human beings to physically affect their environment. Human beings become capable of extraordinary amounts of material production. Factories that can produce linen, cotton textiles, woolen textiles, iron, steel, at phenomenal rates, at rates people never could have imagined a few hundred years earlier. By the 19th century, the skies of England and of continental Europe are being blackened by the smokestacks of industry as this incredible productive process begins reaching extraordinary heights. And along the way, not only do we have this rapid transformation of industries and invention of industries, such as the textile industry and the iron and steel industries, but it has widespread effects just beyond those industries alone. The creation of railroads and steamships, made possible, again, by these industrial products. Those products set off another revolution, a transportation revolution, as tens of thousands of miles of rail are laid across the face of the globe, tying far-flung regions of the globe together. And even when they are not directly tied by rail, steamships that can now plow through any sea, no matter what the wind direction or the lack or existence of wind, steamships make the additional connections across the vast expanses of the ocean. Now people can move products, enormous amounts of products, huge distances at relatively low cost, something that was absolutely not true back in 1500. Now you can begin dealing in huge quantities of things like corn and sugar and coffee and mineral ores because you have an incredible transportation network that allows you to move that material, despite its bulk, vast distances at low costs. Another change that comes about as a result of the rise of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution is urbanization. In the 18th century, in Europe, a city of perhaps 50,000 people would be considered large. That would be a very large city as of the 18th century. By the middle and late 19th century, large cities count 200, 300, 400,000 people. We have seen this enormous increase in population. Now, some of this is due to actual population growth. Food is being produced at larger amounts than ever before. Famine is less likely to occur, in part because food can now be moved more efficiently. At times, famine has occurred in the past simply because there's one province that's having a drought and there's no food, and another province 1,000 miles away has huge amounts of food, but there's no efficient way to get it from province B to province A and relieve that problem. Now there is, through railroads and more efficient transportation systems in general. But there is also the reality that part of this urban growth is due to the fact that people are moving from the rural areas into the cities. As the peasant agriculture of the past begins to give way to commercial agriculture in the 19th and 20th centuries, more and more peasants find there is no land for them. There have been victims of the enclosure system or other forms of legal process which cost them their land. These people begin to move towards urban areas. Our peasant agriculture has so subdivided the land that there isn't enough land to go around for the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. So, again, people migrate to the urban areas because that's where the work is now. That's where the great industrial plants are rising. This industrial revolution also gives rise to the great powers of the world at this time. Initially, England becomes the dominant industrial power of the world. It is the workshop of the world, the leading, in fact, for a time, seemingly the only industrial power. But then others rise. Germany, France, Holland. By the late 19th century, the United States is rapidly advancing and will become the world's leading industrial power in the early 20th century. Later on, Japan, certainly by the early 20th century, mid-20th century, has become one of the great industrial powers of the world. These countries encompass within them not only significant populations, but the industrial power to extend their authority over significant parts of the globe. We're going to see this in the process of imperialism that takes place during the 19th and 20th centuries, where much of the globe becomes subordinated to a few powers, particularly countries like England and France, that dominate much of the globe, including places like Africa and the Middle East and much of Asia, become subordinated to these great powers. Indeed, the second half of the 19th century marks the rise of colonialism on an order that could not have been imagined in an earlier time. Yes, there had been earlier empires. We've seen some of this, the French and the British, fighting over imperial control through a series of wars in the 18th century. But now, in the second half of the 19th century, there is this massive explosion of territorial seizures by the European powers. England alone will add 4 million square miles and 60 million people to its imperial system. Imagine that, 4 million square miles and 60 million people in the space of about 50 years come under the control of the British, become part of their empire. If we look at the world itself, Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, the rest of Africa during the second half of the 19th century is subordinated to European colonial powers. They literally carve it up into a series of colonies. When the Ottoman Empire collapses in the early 20th century, the French and the British quickly move in and extend their control over much of that region as well. China, although it remains independent, sees its border, its coastal area, and its large coastal cities subordinated to European control. Much of Southeast Asia falls under the control of the French. So we have this incredible outburst of imperialism in the second half of the 19th century. Now, as this is going on, something else is happening to help explain why the sudden outburst of imperialism. One of the causes for this outburst has to do with the position of England in the world economy. Up until the middle of the 19th century, England was the unquestioned industrial power of the world. No one was even running a close second. England had experienced the first industrial revolution in the history of the world. And now it stood for a time at the end of the 18th and through the first half of the 19th century virtually alone in terms of that type of industrial power. During that time, the British were more than willing to engage in sort of free trade and to promote the idea of free trade because, of course, they didn't have any serious competitors as industrial powers. But in the second half of the 19th century, that situation changes as Germany, France, Holland, and then the United States begin to move up as significant industrial powers in their own right. Furthermore, that growth is based in all of these countries, including England, on the development of large modern corporations. Corporations that dominate sectors of the world economy. The chemical production of the world economy in the late 19th century is dominated by two companies, one in Germany, one in England. So these were enormous new enterprises. And they were faced with significant competition from each other and from other countries, seeking both sources of raw materials and markets. These companies engaged in intense competition in the world economy. The problem for governments in Europe was how to protect these corporations. And the answer became, in part, the extension of imperial control. If territories were seized in Africa or in the Middle East, in Asia, then those resources, those markets, could be guaranteed for one's own corporations. English corporations could take advantage of English colonies, German corporations of German colonies. Now, this was not the only reason for the expansion of imperial control in these decades. There was also the fact that earlier developments in the world economy and in world history had undermined many of these non-Western societies. For example, the slave trade in Africa had done enormous damage to African societies and created incredible amounts of instability. Furthermore, there had been the arming of Africa in previous centuries as Westerners sold huge amounts of firearms to African societies, creating high levels of conflict and creating opportunities for Europeans to expand their control in such regions. So disintegration of social stability in places like Africa contributed to this process. Yet another factor that helps motivate and justify this imperial expansion are a series of ideologies that become pervasive in Europe at this time. One of them is racism, and specifically scientific racism, the belief that there is a scientific justification for differences between different races of human beings, and that not only are there such differences, but that there are distinct levels of superiority and inferiority between different races. So scientific racism doesn't just say, well, there are physiological differences between some people. People's skin colors are different, etc. They're saying, no, those are important because people are actually superior or inferior human beings depending upon what race they belong to. And in turn, that belief, as unscientific as it really was, justifies the imposition of external control upon those races, those societies that are deemed to be inferior. Of course, we have a right to control the Middle East or Africa or Asia because these people are inferior. This is the argument. Social Darwinism contributes to that same idea. Social Darwinists argue that, in fact, the way human societies work is by intense competition. and that inevitably the superior races within human society will rise to the top because they will be able to impose their will upon inferior races. So social Darwinism says, well, this is a natural mechanism, a mechanism of natural selection, that inevitably the superior races will be able to impose their control upon the inferior races. So this is a good thing that we're doing. This is the way it's supposed to work. This is the way it works in nature. Now, of course, what's really happening here is that the people who happen to have the guns, superior or not, are the ones who are going to be able to impose their will upon others. Finally, there is the justification of the white man's burden. That we're not just doing this for selfish reasons. We have an obligation to help these people, as inferior as they may be. Nevertheless, what we are doing is taking on a great reforming burden. Without us, there'd be no civilization among these societies. Again, quickly forgetting the fact that these societies in Africa, the Middle East, Asia had had their own cultures and civilizations for thousands of years. Nevertheless, Europeans look upon it and say, no, no, no. Real civilization is European civilization. And we are taking on this burden of civilizing these people by imposing colonialism. So all of these ideologies help justify the imposition of imperial control around the globe by European powers in the second half of the 19th century. During their era of colonialism, which for most parts of Africa, Asia, and Southeast Asia and the Middle East extends until the middle of the 20th century, the imposition of imperial control brings radical changes. One, the disruption of existing political systems. They're tribal systems, monarchies. Most of these are swept away by imperial control. Secondly, the training of local elites to serve in the imperial bureaucracies. In other words, the Europeans aren't going to try to rule these countries all on their own. They're also going to train a very select group of the local inhabitants to assist in the imperial process. We see the effort on a very limited scale, therefore, to impose Western religion, Western education. Now again, how far this goes depends upon the imperial power. In most cases, education was not widespread. They only wanted to educate a small percentage of the population. But the idea that Western religion and Western education is superior helps generate this attempt. Perhaps most drastically changed are the agricultural and economic systems of these societies. Most of them go from being basic peasant economies, agricultural economies based on subsistence agriculture, to economies focused on the export of primary goods, whether those are mineral products or agricultural products. And depending upon the country or area, it may mean mass displacement of peasants, creation of commercial plantations, the rounding up of tens of thousands of local inhabitants to work in mining operations. But in general, these economies are reshaped from subsistence agriculture into economies focused on the export of products for the world economy. So we see that Europe is changing, the West is changing in terms of the rise of capitalism to its full extent, the industrialization of the West. But we also see that these changes are having impacts globally now, because the West is trying to take many of its own ideas and values and impose them, including direct political control, upon other societies. And this will have a fundamental role to play in many of the revolutions that come. In other words, the reaction to this process, to this subordination of these societies by the West. Now, in the West itself, the idea of capitalism does not go unchallenged. Besides the everyday people who resist transformation by trying to avoid getting involved in wage labor, peasants who try to hold on to their traditional way of life, there are critiques of capitalism, criticisms that are developed by intellectuals, by political figures. Many of these people see in capitalism a highly exploitative system. They see the suffering of industrial workers in the 18th and 19th centuries. Industrial labor is harsh and difficult. Frequently, children are included in the labor system. Long hours of labor, 12, 14 hours a day, were not unusual. Wages are low, near subsistence level. And while conditions in agriculture and traditional agriculture were not exactly rosy, industrial capitalism has another disadvantage, and that is the uncertainty which it imposes on people's lives. If there's a recession, if the economy slows down, people are fired en masse. You close the factory for a while until things get better. So you've got work one day, the next day you're out of work, and when you will get employment again is very difficult to say. Living conditions for the working classes in the urban areas of Europe were abominable, particularly in the early to mid-level stages of the Industrial Revolution. As a result of these conditions and the general belief among many that capitalism was fundamentally inequitable, that what it was creating was a class of a few rich and then a mass group of impoverished urban workers, a series of alternative visions are developed. One of them is called anarcho-syndicalism. What anarcho-syndicalism argues, first of all, is that, as do other anarchist philosophies, is that the state is an important source of the inequality that exists in modern society. What that means is it is the state that helps create this capitalist system and keeps it going. We talked about the poor laws in England a few minutes ago. That would be an example to anarcho-syndicalists of what's going on. It's the state that's doing that. It's helping force people into the system. It helps maintain the system. When there are strikes, the government calls out troops to shoot at the strikers to break the strike. Here is the state enforcing this inequitable system. So one of the things that the anarcho-syndicalists are anxious to do is eliminate a strong centralized state, because a strong centralized state is simply going to enforce this kind of inequity, is going to back up this inequitable system. As an alternative, what the anarcho-syndicalists suggest is the creation of a series of communities of workers and peasants who would largely control and manage their own affairs. In some ways, this is a flashback to the past. It is suggesting that what we really want are the ideals of the past, when artisans owned their own tools, worked in their own shops, made their own goods, worked closely with their own journeymen, that kind of ideal. And in agriculture, the ideal of the peasant community once again, and that people could work together in a harmonious fashion and not exploit each other, and there would not be vast differences in wealth. So on the one hand, they're reaching back to this idealized past of artisans and peasants. On the other hand, they're also offering it as the alternative to the future. You know, instead of facing capitalism with its exploitation and the disparities of wealth, this is the idealized kind of world that we want to create for the future by creating that kind of society where people, artisans and peasants, have control of the means of production. They control the shops, they control the land, and produce goods for each other's benefit, rather than a system of exploitation. So that's the anarcho-syndicalist view. The socialists offer a different perspective. Rather than trying to simply do away with modern industry, socialism suggests what we need to do is redistribute wealth. That capitalism, as the anarcho-syndicalist suggests, is inherently inequitable. It's going to create inequities in society. Right? What we need to do is not dismantle the existing system, but particularly to use the state to redistribute wealth. For example, we could tax industrialists at a very high rate and then redistribute those funds in the form of social welfare projects, more education, housing subsidies. We can use the state to assist people in organizing unions that will have a larger voice in running the industrial process. We can make a difference by redistributing the wealth that is being produced by this capitalist system, and particularly use the state to achieve that end. So that's the socialist alternative. And finally, there is communism. We've talked a little bit about Marx's ideas at the beginning of the course and talking about theory and trying to develop some theories that will help us explain how revolutions come about, why they come about. But Marx was also a revolutionary in his own right. He was promoting revolution. He believed firmly that revolution would take place, and he had developed, once again, a very coherent set of ideas about why this would happen, how it would happen, and a compelling critique of capitalism. His critique of capitalism, however, although it includes the kind of thing that the socialists and the anarcho-syndicalists would talk about, namely that we have these great inequalities created between rich and poor, between the capitalist and the worker. Well, that's true. Marx's fundamental criticism is not that inequality, although he sees it as very important. His fundamental criticism is that what makes humans unique, what makes them what they are, is that they are creative producers, that human beings become fully human in the process of their creative activities. So work should not be an endless drudgery. It shouldn't be somebody standing on a production line, twisting every screw that comes by, or every ratchet, ratcheting up every nut that goes by. No, that is dehumanizing. That is the kind of thing that modern industry does to people. What people need to do is to have control in their work situations, where they can be creative, when they can control what they're doing, how they go about doing it. This is the fundamental problem with capitalism, in Marx's mind, is that it takes people and eliminates what is most important in making them human, namely the ability to be creative and be productive in their own right, rather than simply being a cog in the wheel. Rather than simply being subjected to X number of hours at so much pay, you stand on an assembly line and do the same repetitive process over and over again. Human beings need to be creative. Capitalism calls for specialization. This person is going to be an engineer, chemical engineer. This person will be a civil engineer. This person over here is a specialist, let us say, in time motion studies. This worker over here is a specialist in running the following machine, okay? And that's what they do well. Okay? They run a lathe, a metal lathe, and they cut pieces of machinery, and they do that all day, every day, day after day. So they're specialized in that one thing. Marx says, no, that's the problem. People don't want to be, nor should they be, spending their entire lives doing one single thing. They should allow to be creative. Perhaps they will, if they have the talent, operate a machine lathe for a while. But then maybe they'll go out and work as a teacher for a couple of years. They can do different things, explore their creative possibilities. In Marx's mind, this problem with capitalism is going to lead to revolutionary change. Remember, when we talked about the theories of revolution, about Marx, his concern with the modes of production, that you have different ways that people organize themselves for economic activity. It may be slavery, it might be kinship groups, could be a feudal or tribute system. And with each of these, he suggested that at a certain point, the technology reaches a stage of development that the mode of production can no longer accommodate. So a revolution has to take place so a new mode of production can take hold and most successfully exploit that technology. Marx sees this happening in capitalism. That is his vision of the future. Specifically, what he says is that, yes, we've had the first industrial revolution, but now we're headed into a second industrial revolution. And in this regard, he was right, where machines are going to do more and more of the work. Under these circumstances, what we need are people who have an opportunity to be creative, because with machines doing more and more of the work, people will simply be made irrelevant unless they have creative opportunities. With machines doing so much of the work, this system of wage labor, highly specialized labor, will not be able to take full advantage of these new opportunities. I mean, here is a world open to us where we're going to be able to meet our basic material needs. But if we just become slaves to the machines, if we're simply running around feeding one piece of paper or one piece of wood or metal into a machine after another, then the opportunities for fully exploiting this new technology will be lost. We won't have the creative people to produce new advances, to take full advantage of this new opportunity where most of us will not have to labor and use our physical might in order to produce goods. We need creative people. We need the opportunity to be creative. That's why revolutions will occur. The other reason why revolutions will occur is because of this growing gap in wealth, that as capitalism continues to expand, we will have more and more a case of a few very rich members of the elite and more people driven into the proletariat, driven into the working class. Small businesses will be overrun by these huge corporations that are rising. Small business people will find themselves driven out of business and into the working class. Artisans who have survived, those that have survived up until now, they'll all be driven out as well. And more you'll have just two groups, the rich capitalists and the desperate proletarians. And these two factors, this contradiction of capitalism that it can't provide for creativity among people, it can't promote creativity, and the disparities in wealth that will accelerate will make revolutions inevitable. This is what will bring on revolutions against capitalism. This is what will bring on communist revolutions. In the communist future, Marx sees a world in which, yes, all of the technical accomplishments of capitalism will remain. I mean, he's a great fan of capitalism when it comes to its incredible productive capabilities. You know, he praises capitalism and says, oh, no system before has ever been able to do what this system can do in terms of creating material goods. Problem is what it does to human beings in the process. So what we're going to have in the communist future is still that technology, but we will free people up where we will let them take advantage of their creative instincts and become more fully human. Try different occupations, work in different areas of the economy where they can exercise their creative inclinations. And we will have a system which is far more equitable in distributions of wealth. We will abolish private property so that a few capitalists cannot accumulate all of the wealth, so that there will be enough for all. So we will have a society in which there is equity in terms of economic distribution, and a society in which there is opportunity for creativity from everyone in that society. Ultimately, interestingly enough, it's made possible by these new technologies that have come to light as a result of the capitalist revolution in the West at this time. So, in the end, as much as Marx is a revolutionary and sees these revolutions as inevitable, he is also very much a modernist. He is someone who promotes the ideas of the modern world. These new technologies, these new ideas, those are the things that lie in the future as much as they lie in the present. They lie in the capitalist present. They will also be a part of the communist future. But not everyone was that pleased with modernity in general. We've seen the anarcho-syndicalists, the socialists, and Marx criticize capitalism, and Marx in particular talking about the inevitability of these revolutions. But at the same time, there are events occurring, particularly in the early 20th century, which for many people raise the question whether we should be pursuing this course of modernity at all. Maybe what we're doing is very dangerous. Maybe it's not very good. Now, even Marx, even though he sees a revolution coming, still believes that in the end, this technology is the best thing for humanity. Much of what capitalism has created is good. It's just that they're going about it in the wrong way. But other events occur that raise questions about whether modernity is the most effective means of pursuing the future. The examples I give here are specifically in the West, although as we will see, other people later in the 20th century will have other doubts that they will raise about modernity. First of all, the First World War. In the First World War, 20 million people are killed between combatants and innocent civilians. Billions upon billions of dollars of property are destroyed. And in this terrible event, what is clear is that this mass destruction was made possible by the same technologies that Marx and all the capitalists were so fond of. Those great factories with their smokestacks, were able to produce things like machine guns, tanks, poison gas that helped slaughter millions of people. So one of the issues raised by the First World War is perhaps we're creating the instruments of our own destruction. Rather than some idyllic future that capitalists or communists might envision, maybe it's far worse than that. Maybe this technology is going to destroy all of us. And it killed 20 million people. The ability of human beings to inflict harm upon each other was rising at an exponential rate. Then there comes the aftermath of the war, and specifically the great Spanish influenza epidemic, which hits especially in 1919 and 1920. It kills approximately 25 million people around the world. And it may have been far more than that. Some estimates run to twice this number. We'll never know for sure because no one could possibly keep count of all of the people that were lost as a result of this epidemic that spread across the globe. What was striking about the epidemic, the influenza epidemic, that had such devastating consequences, and whether we're talking Europe, the United States, India, all of these societies suffered enormous human losses. The most striking aspect of it was that modern science, for all its ability, and modern technology, for all its ability, to inflict huge losses in human life in the war, could do essentially nothing to stop this epidemic. I mean, the most that could be done was that people could be isolated, people could wear masks, but nobody knew what was actually causing the epidemic. Nobody knew why it was so damaging. There had been influenza epidemics in the past, but no one was able to control the causes of this epidemic. No one was able to stem the enormous loss of life that resulted from this pandemic that spread across the globe. Even today, scientists are still trying to uncover why this particular epidemic was so damaging. They've tried digging up, for example, bodies of people that were buried in the far Arctic North, hoping that there's enough preserved of their bodies, these cadavers, to analyze and determine the particular causes and effects of this influenza. So here is a two-sided coin, both of which do not reflect very well on modern science and technology. On the one hand, the enormous damage that it could do, and on the other hand, its seeming inability to control something like a disease that spread across the globe in 1919. So this raises questions about, science apparently can do a lot of damage, but it can't be a lot of help. Then comes the Great Depression, essentially a collapse of the world economy, where world commerce drops by more than 60% and industrial production around the world by more than 30%. Again, this was something that wasn't supposed to happen. There had always been business cycles as long as there had been capitalism, great bursts of growth and then recessions that would hit, even depressions that would strike for a time. But the idea that the entire world economy could collapse in this fashion, and certainly in the mid-1930s, it was still unclear whether it would ever recover again. People began to doubt whether, in fact, the world economy would ever return to the levels of growth that it had once known. Many people believed, in our own society included, that this indeed was the end of capitalism and that communism would soon take its place, because here was the clear evidence that a free market system such as had existed in the past, a system of capitalist development, was simply so deeply flawed that it had led to this collapse, and that only action by the state, and particularly a system that leaned towards a communist resolution of the issue, would possibly restore the world economy to any degree of health. So at the beginning of the 20th century, in the first 3.5 decades, we see a series of events that seriously shake the faith that many people have in this system. Remember, even Marx, as a revolutionary critical of capitalism, believed in the basic ideas of modernity, particularly the idea of the technologies that it could develop that would make possible such incredible growth in material production. But here, in these first 3.5 decades, we see events that raise serious questions about whether that is going to happen, whether humanity may not indeed be on the path to some capitalist or even communist nirvana. It may be on the fast track to destruction. So this raises some serious issues among intellectuals and even among, as we will see, revolutionaries about exactly what it is that they are trying to achieve in their revolutions. What is it that humanity should be striving for in terms of its goals, in terms of trying to transform societies? Now, in addition to these striking events that impact people and the way that they think about modernity, there were intellectual and cultural developments that raise similar kinds of concerns. Although many of the people that we're going to talk about were highly creative, made tremendous contributions to intellectual thought, to science, nevertheless, many of their discoveries or ideas also raised troubling questions about the modern world. First of all, Sigmund Freud. Now, Freud in recent decades has been the subject of a great deal of criticism among psychiatrists, psychologists, etc., because of his preoccupation specifically with the issue of sexuality and to what extent does it shape one's psyche. But there's no question that Freud was a great pioneer of psychology and psychiatry, of coming to understand the human mind. Certainly, he is considered one of the great pioneers in this area. And certainly, millions of people in the modern world benefit from one type or another of psychiatric or psychological treatment, counseling, etc. However, there's a downside to all of this as well, because what Freud is saying, and what many modern-day psychologists and psychiatrists will tell you, is that human beings, to a considerable extent, are influenced by their own unconscious minds, and that those influences are not always highly rational. When we look at the early modern revolutionaries, these were people who were influenced by the Enlightenment thinkers, by what is called the Age of Reason, by the belief that human beings could use their rational minds to analyze the world around them, understand it better, and make it better, whether it was in the area of science, politics, economics. This was an enormous influence on these early revolutions. But all of that is based on the idea that we are rational creatures, that we think logically, develop our ideas logically, and therefore can use that thought process to improve the world around us, to understand it better, and make it better. But if you think about Freud's analysis, what Freud is suggesting is perhaps we're not nearly as rational as we thought we were. Oftentimes we appear to be compelled by irrational motivations, irrational thoughts. We see this in our everyday lives. You see somebody, someone you consider quite mature and reasonable, and then they get a flat tire on the way to an important appointment. They get out of the car, discover they don't have a spare tire, and they take out the lug wrench and start beating the car with it. Why is this person doing that? Are they crazy? Well, we've all done a little bit of this. You have problems, your stove won't light at night, and you start cursing the stove. Well, the stove's an inanimate object. It can't possibly do anything against you, and you're denouncing it. We all engage in some degree of irrational behavior. But this then raises the question, to what extent are we truly rational? And can we draw a line? And are human beings as a group capable of consistent rational behavior? Because if these great ideas to change the world, to change political system, social system, and economic system are allegedly based on rational plans, if the human beings making those rational plans, that rational analysis, and the people who are supposed to pursue these rational ideas to create a better world, if in fact we all have embedded within us this deep seed, this deep element of irrationality, what's going to become of the world? And certainly when you look at things like the First World War, people were often tempted to say, well, this is madness. This is just plain madness that we're doing this to each other. So Freud's ideas, as much as they may help people in terms of trying to understand their own subconscious, etc., also raise troubling questions about how rational human beings are in general, and to what extent can they hope to really use rational thought to improve their world. In science, there are similar kinds of issues. People like Max Planck and Albert Einstein developing ideas in physics about quantum physics and about relativity. Einstein is the easiest one to understand, in the sense that what Einstein was talking about with his theory of relativity is that matter can become energy and energy can become matter. If you accelerate an object to the speed of light squared, that's his famous formula, E equals mc squared. If you accelerate it to the speed of light squared, it'll turn into energy. Okay, so what's wrong with that, other than the fact that it helps you make an atomic bomb? Up until this time, people had understood the world in very mechanistic terms. I mean, the world is solid, right? We have objects, we have this table, we have walls around us, books. These are solid objects, and we can understand the world as Newton once explained it to us in the 18th century, that objects impacting one another, affecting each other, colliding with each other. These are understandable, observable characteristics of the physical world, and we can be comfortable with those. Makes sense. Our senses tell us that's what it is. The world around us is made up of solid objects that may impact each other. But with ideas like quantum theory and Einstein's ideas about relativity, suddenly we see the world in a very different light. Everything that is solid can become non-solid, can become just pure energy. That this world that we see as so fixed and so secure and working like a giant machine apparently doesn't work that way at all. And for most of us, it's just incomprehensible what physicists talk about. How does the world really work? What makes it tick? This raises, again, questions about how we view the world and to what extent can we really control it. To what extent can the average human being understand the world around them? I mean, do most of us out there, understand the theory of relativity very well? No. I can give a very simplistic explanation, which is about as far as my understanding goes. Or quantum theory. Do we understand, the forces that shape the movements of the universe around us? No. It's largely beyond our comprehension. So we've now presented with a physical world which seems so solid and so secure, which now is not solid and secure at all. Apparently, it can transform itself into pure energy under certain conditions. And many of the explanations of how the world does work are simply beyond the comprehension of most human beings. So how are we to control and make better this world around us if most of us don't even understand it? Once again, the idea that human beings have finally gotten their hands on nature and are controlling nature and making it do the will of human beings, we're now shaping the world. All of this is thrown into doubt by these discoveries. As productive as these discoveries may prove to be ultimately in terms of the development of nuclear science, etc., they also raise serious questions for most people in terms of, do they understand the world at all? There's a great trend in the 20th century depicting scientists as mad, irrational, power-driven lunatics in many cases. Think of how many movies were produced in the first half of the 20th century with that theme in mind. Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein becomes one of the favorite themes of science fiction movies, because here is this person trying to meddle with nature and seeing nature, when he meddles with it, comes to destroy him. This becomes one of the themes of popular culture, that we can't understand this stuff, and these people that we've put in charge of all of this, they're crazy. They don't know what they're doing. So again, this idea that we have a rational world and we can manage it, and we have a physical world that we can understand and control, are coming into doubt. Some of the same kind of concern is seen in the artists of the 20th century. The artwork, such as that of Picasso, reflects the same kind of vision. Because what Picasso is doing, in many ways, is saying, you know, the scientists are right. The world around you is not as you see it. You know, we know now that the way we perceive, for example, color and light, is not the simple idea, well, light is there and I see it. There's this whole complicated set of interactions, you know, between your eye and the retina of your eye and objects out there that help create this image of color, of light, etc. And Picasso is saying the same thing, that what we think we see as a solid, secure, understandable universe really isn't there. You know, when he paints a figure of a woman or an animal or a man, you look at it and say, I can barely recognize, I can see maybe a nose or eyes, but the rest of it, you know, what does it mean? And what Picasso is saying is, well, you know, it's really not the physical world as we see it that is reality. It's the internal reality of that person, what that person means to us. And I'm trying to express that by painting them in such a way that their external reality reflects their internal reality. So we get pictures that, you know, more and more people say, oh God, I don't understand modern art. You know, it doesn't make any sense to me. Because there are images that just, I can't understand them. But what modern artists are saying in many ways is, well, this is what science has been telling us about the universe around us. It does not just consist of a nice, neat set of physical building blocks that we can move around, we can understand and control as we once imagined back in the 18th century in the days of the Enlightenment. Now we're not certain about that at all. There is also the question of modern industry and modern technology and what it does to human beings, a theme that has not disappeared here in the 21st century. Charlie Chaplin's film, Modern Times, presents this in a striking fashion, where he presents himself as this factory worker, and in one of the scenes he gets caught up in the gears of a machine and nearly gets shriveled as a result of it. He pictures himself as a victim of this massive machine that he cannot control. And that is precisely the way many people feel about modern technology. People who are working in factories in the 20th century, even if they feel they might be better paid than they were in the 19th century, still feel as though they are the victims of the machines, that the machines are running the world. Anyone who works on an assembly line in the 20th century certainly gets that message loud and clear. You stand on this assembly line all day, and again, you're tightening one bolt as it goes by, you're filling a cup with a piece of food, the next person seals them all, and you do this over and over and over again. And how fast do you do it? Depends on how fast the machine goes. How long do you have to do it? As long as they tell you you have to do it, because the machine will go on hour after hour, day after day, and they'll just switch shifts, and the next person will come in and do the same thing. So who's managing this whole thing? Who's controlling it? The machine, apparently. So Chaplin's work reflects the very real fears and concerns of much of humankind that, well, machines are supposed to be benefiting them, producing this enormous material wealth, that they feel in many ways that they are becoming enslaved to the machines. And finally, a bit of contemporary pop culture, but at that time a significant event, at least for members of elite families in England and the United States, the sinking of the Titanic. One of the things that's striking about this event is, why are people so obsessed with it that even at the end of the 20th century we're still making movies about it? Because it was such a statement about the failure of technologies in the face of nature. Here was this ship that was supposedly unsinkable, that was a product of the latest of modern technologies, and yet one encounter with an iceberg and it goes to the bottom and drowns most of the people that were on it. Not most of the rich people, of course, but most of the people that were on it. Here is a compelling symbol for the concerns of the 20th century that also will help influence many of the revolutions we're going to talk about. And that is, what happens when, in fact, these technologies that we think we can use to control the world around us prove to be so fragile, that we appear to be not much better off than our ancestors, when they were rubbing sticks together to make fire. Because here with this modern technology, suddenly, in a matter of hours, this technology was destroyed and went to the bottom. These are the kinds of issues and concerns that spread through much of Western society in this period, in the 20th century, as people try to come to grips with the modern world. We see both criticisms of capitalism, that specific part of modernity, in people like Marx and others, but we also see this other set of developments, less coherent and organized, but concerns about where is the modern world going, and is modernity a process that we want to continue to pursue. You can see that this is an issue, particularly with the last revolution that we look at, but it has echoes in some of the other revolutions as well. Do we want to continue down that path? Finally, one other element in this process that is extremely important. We spent an earlier part of this session talking about the expansion of the West and imperialism. But the 20th century is marked particularly by the reaction against the rise of colonialism and imperialism, both within the West but in the larger world, specifically in the colonial world itself. In the West, people like Joseph Conrad helped create doubts in the minds of many Westerners about the efficacy, the appropriateness, indeed morality of imperialism. His novel, The Heart of Darkness, is a compelling and troubling portrait of what happened in the real colonial world, where imperialist colonial governors and business people were not really there to pick up the white man's burden, but rather to exploit local populations to the maximum, and where that process often turned back upon them and brought out the very worst of them as human beings, as exploiters, as ruthless as anyone could imagine. So we have within the West itself increasing doubts about this process. And in the colonial world, figures like Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi, a native of India, educated in England, was among that select few that colonial designers intended to educate from the colonial world to help administer and manage these imperial systems. But Gandhi, like so many of these people, took the ideas from his training, Western ideas about the rights of the citizen, the rights of man, liberal government, and turned them back upon imperialism, criticizing the imperialists, criticizing the West on the grounds that what right do you have to impose imperial rule upon us when your own governments are founded upon the idea of the rights of the citizen, elected government, and yet we have none of that in the colonial world. This process that unfolds during the 20th century has an important contribution to make in the rise of nationalism. And we will see, again, nationalism playing a significant role in many of these 20th century revolutions. People can identify with each other as a community in a variety of ways, finding a common history, a common language, as they did in places like France and the United States in earlier centuries. But in the 20th century, one of the important ways is that people begin to identify with each other because they are not something. They are not this external colonial force. Perhaps we in this part of Africa or the Middle East or Asia have never thought of ourselves before as a nation, but we begin to think in those terms precisely because an external force has imposed its will and its control upon us. And one of our means of escaping that is by identifying with each other, by beginning to formulate the concept of a nation that we can throw back against the imperialists, that we can use as an inspiration to get rid of colonial control. We also have, in this period, the rise of the Soviet model, because one of the first modern revolutions is the Soviet model, which provides the opportunity for people in the colonial world to see a society which was dominated externally, as we will see, which was underdeveloped, and yet which throws off that external domination and creates a modern economy and a modern state. Finally, one other force in the colonial world is the rise of Islam, and modern Islam, and its ideas of an Islamic community. This will be particularly important for the revolution in Iran when we look at it. People identifying not just based on ethnicity and the common idea of a nation, but the idea that by belonging to Islam itself, they belong to a very specific community, and use that as a means of both creating that community and rejecting external control, rejecting colonialism. This, along with nationalism, will be a critical factor, as we will see in the next segment.